And here we are, actually uploading a video on a Sunday. Never say I don't do anything for you. So today we're going to be changing things up just slightly. Not wearing a shirt that's relevant to any game or Dungeons & Dragons, anything like that. And we're going to be talking about something that isn't necessarily a tabletop game or an experience playing tabletop games specifically. We're going to be talking about a method with which to play tabletop role-playing games. Notably, Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder are really big on this method, but I imagine that you could do the same with a game like Shadowrun, Stars Without Number, something like that. And what this is a virtual tabletop. There are many different tabletop virtualization softwares, one of which is Roll20. It's very popular. It essentially makes a virtual battle mat with which you can make little tokens, little representations of your characters to move around. You can make character sheets, things like that. Another one that's very popular is called Fantasy Grounds, which is essentially just like Roll20, but it is a separate application. Roll20 is a browser application. Fantasy Grounds is a separate application. And within it, its big selling point is that you can buy rule books from within the game and then apply the rules to your grid and stuff directly. I'm not super experienced with Fantasy Grounds, and I can't really see a positive to buying a rule book again in virtual when I have so many different rule books already, and then I can just use those rule books when I'm playing online. But Fantasy Grounds is an option if you're really into having everything in one sort of closed package. And then another option that I'm aware of is Tabletop Simulator, which is a 3D tabletop environment, and it has its own positives and negatives as well. I'm going to consider it a tabletop virtualization or a virtual tabletop VTT software for the sake of this video, but most people are going to play on Roll20, I find. But TTS is something that's very cool. Other board games are actually really good to play on Tabletop Simulator, and because of its 3D environments and it has a virtual reality support as well, I think that it is probably one of the best options for an immersive experience, but it might not necessarily be the most user-friendly or easy to get into. So pretty much everything I'm going to be saying in this video, everything is going to be a negative. There's no real way to put that. Not really a way to put anything in a positive light when you're talking about virtual tabletops. And it's not because they suck. It is more because virtual tabletops are inherently limited in ways that just playing on a normal battle mat isn't. And none of them really can get over problems that aren't really they're causing, which is limitations of controlling a computer, using a keyboard and mouse, versus using your own hands and like little miniatures on a board. Every action becomes much, much more difficult on a virtual tabletop. So the first thing that you need to consider when you're going to be using a virtual tabletop is which one you want to pick. So I generally use Roll20. It seems to have one of the highest user bases because it is a browser application. I would wager that it has the highest user base. The initial cost to get in is free, which is very good. And then there are actually paid tiers that allow you to store more content on their server, so you can upload more images that you're going to use as sort of like placeholder pawns for characters, boards and stuff like that. And then it has paid tiers as well. So I'm going to be talking mostly about Roll20. Fantasy Grounds, you can take a lot of what I'm talking about as well and apply that there. Fantasy Grounds is a paid service. I believe that you just have to buy it straight up. And then it has greater tiers, and you can purchase like rule books and things. It ends up being phenomenally expensive. It's like one of those train set games. Very, very pricey. So I recommend people try Roll20. You're going to end up running into issues that are also not related to the software with the people that you're going to play with. So I would advise if you're getting into playing tabletop games, you should probably try to find other people to play with in person to begin with. A tremendous amount of communication is done through body language and intonation, and things that aren't necessarily the words being said. The way that I motion with my head and hands and stuff is providing you with a tremendous amount of information, as is my intonation. But because we're not occupying physical space with each other, much of what I'm saying is going to end up being lost through some sort of immaterial means. Being actually in a room with somebody makes communication much easier. And sitting around a gaming table is the preferable way to play a tabletop game, especially if you're new. It's much easier to communicate that way. On a virtual tabletop, you do not have this benefit. A lot of them have ways that you can use a webcam or something so that people can at least see you at the time that you're talking, which for one actually makes role-playing characters much easier because you can stand or sit in a certain way to represent your character as well. But you will end up with these ridiculous situations on VTTs where the people who you play with are really weird and don't want to turn on webcams, or they don't have them, they don't want to use them. You'll have people who have really shitty mic quality, and people are just like typing in chat and things. Very strange. These are not issues that you would run into if you were playing actually at a table. At the very best, if you can get together a group of people to play on a virtual tabletop, you should try and make sure, like actually in your posting or whatever, if you're making an advertisement to play on something like LFG or something like that, Facebook group, on Roll20 itself, there is actually a posting. You should make sure that people have webcams, or at least have decent mic quality. So the first negative that I have to mention is that a virtual tabletop is just missing the face-to-face interaction, which makes role-playing games so much fun to play. You're with other people kind of playing. You'd be surprised because I'm so awkward and dumb, but I actually come from or I shouldn't say come from, I have experience with a lot of stage acting, especially with like Shakespearean plays and things like that. And then producing sets and stuff for it. I did it through high school and a little bit beyond that. And so being a player or a dungeon master in a Dungeons and Dragons game for me is sort of kind of a theatrical experience. It kind of reminds me of that. And as a result, and I think that a lot of players, even if they haven't been actual players, thespians, what have you, they will appreciate that concept as well. And that's completely lost on a lot of virtual tabletops. Bridging off of that, you're going to have kind of weird people that you're going to be running into. People like myself, which I'm not going to say that I'm like super normal or anything. I'm making D&D videos. People like myself who kind of live far away from any other gaming groups you'll run into us from time to time. Slightly strange people who live in semi-rural areas, let's say. But you'll also have people that are unable to or unwilling to go meet people in person to play Dungeons and Dragons, which I understand for people with social anxiety and things like that, it can be kind of difficult to make that sort of first step, and you're so used to playing World of Warcraft or Diablo or whatever, other fantasy things on the computer, and you can't imagine that it's that different. That's going to be weird for you if you're more of a neurotypical kind of person. You're going to be running into people who are not super used to social interaction, let's say. And this can be a positive experience for all of you, those of you who are better socially adjusted and those of you who aren't, because you're going to kind of have this cultural exchange, let's say. Both be better for it. But because of the way that officiation and other topics are in Dungeons & Dragons, like so much of the play experience is dependent on other people, as opposed to a video game where much of it isn't, aside from maybe opponents in a multiplayer game. Because of the officiation and the play is so based on other people, you will have this problem that if people are kind of weird, or if they're unwilling to hear you out, or if they aren't very socially well adjusted, or if they have, I don't want to say mental issues or disabilities or something, but if you, because that would be kind of cruel, but learning to deal with those kinds of people is important, but you might end up running into people that do fall into categories like that, to put it kind of bluntly, and that does make the play experience of just playing D&D very frustrating. If you don't really like talking to these people, though, you actually end up playing much faster, which can be kind of a positive. It's like a big dungeon or something, but that's kind of a backhanded compliment. So running into kind of weird players is another negative that you're going to hit. So one of the biggest problems that I think is just to do with the UI, and this is a problem I've had with the UI of computers and other technology devices in general, is that the general peripherals that ship with the platform are adequate, but not glove-like. They don't sort of bridge the gap entirely between you and the machine, and it becomes an extension of yourself. Using a keyboard and a mouse is not the best way to possibly control a computer. As we've seen, virtual reality and things like that are much more natural and intuitive. And further still, the VR that we have right now isn't very good. So as that gets better in the future, maybe it will ship with a computer, and this will actually be an issue that's solved. Probably something like Tabletop Simulator would then be the preferable way to play Dungeons & Dragons or games akin to that. But for right now, it's very slow to play on a virtual tabletop. Like, painfully slow. Each movement of a character is, like, sort of annoying and unnatural. And I'm someone who spends a tremendous amount of time on the computer. And I still find it more awkward to move, like, take a token and move a character on a, like, through a grid or something like that online versus doing it in person. Because it's just not how that process works. If you have a pawn, like here's a gray maiden that I painted, right? I have this. I need to move this to another location. So I'm going to pick it up with my hand off of the board and I'm going to put it there. It's instantaneous. Even if it takes the same amount of time to do so on a computer, it's kind of weird and janky. And you also cannot place things exactly where you want them to be a lot of the time. With the way that grids and snapping, they have kind of like the Photoshop snap to location kind of thing built into Roll20 by default. There's ways that you can go around that. You can place things in like sub-grid positioning and all kinds of things, but you have to press buttons and stuff for that. If you want to kind of comedically place your character with a pawn or a miniature like I have, you can just do that. If you want to place it next to your cup of soda when you are playing a game, you can do that. When you're playing on a virtual tabletop, that's sort of removed from the experience as well. So you have these like weird like portraits of your characters or maybe weapons that represent their sort of class or something like that, and they just sort of unorganically move around the board, and it's not very immersive, and it's frustrating as well. And then if you're the dungeon master, drawing the board becomes more difficult at the same time. So there's a couple ways that you can get around that, right? You can actually just make the whole dungeon ahead of time, and that works really well 99% of the time. Or you can do what a bad dungeon master would do and have the players draw the entire board, not like an approximated map of the board like you're supposed to for basic Dungeons & Dragons, but you can just offload the responsibility onto the players entirely, which just moves the problems to them. But still, for like a random encounter that you did not expect, to draw the dimensions of a random room with a marker is extremely easy. Or you can whip down a dungeon tile, or you can do something like that. With Roll20 especially, now maybe this isn't an issue with other games, but you have to scroll through menus of assets to do the equivalent of whipping down a dungeon tile. Or you need to select the marker tool and then draw around a set of squares or grid squares, or if you play a gridless game, a section of space, in order to now have this room for this encounter. That's still annoying. Whereas if you're the DM in person, you can just pick up a marker and then draw around a thing on a battle mat, and then you're done. Or you can just place little... I've seen this happening a lot, more and more as people are concerned with having 3D terrain in real life and still having good visibility. They will just place like pillars in the corner of rooms. So now you can adjust the size of a room however you want. There's many things that you can do in physical, whatever is more comfortable for you. As a biological being that inhabits physical space, you can just do that. Your options are more limited if you're playing on a virtual tabletop. Tabletop Simulator, you can actually make yourself a stack of dungeon tiles and whack them onto the board, but it has its own issues. It's very janky. And the jankiness will be another issue that you're going to run into. All of these softwares, because they are not things that you can directly manipulate with your hands, even Tabletop Simulator, if you are playing in virtual reality, its level of control is very good. But it still is not as accurate as holding objects in your hands that you can make how you want. You are going to run into issues. The physics of something like Tabletop Simulator sends objects flying occasionally. I'm sure that's an issue that they're working on. Things don't quite stack together correctly if you're setting down dungeon tiles. Nothing ever quite behaves right. At least not 100% of the time. It's much better than when it first came out. Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds both run into the same problems where you can never get everything exactly as you want it on an easy and reasonable time scale. You also run into software issues and glitches and incompatibilities and stuff. I never really have had any of these problems, especially on Roll20, but it seems like a lot of people who, for some reason, play online are also not very good with technology, or maybe not inclined to learn about it or something like that. And that makes it very difficult when people cannot get their microphone working because they haven't allowed the permission on Google Chrome or something. If you're playing in person, you don't have to use Google Chrome. So you're not going to have that problem. People's voices work correctly when they arrive. Maybe they're shy and they don't want to speak very loudly or something like that, but you're not going to just not be able to hear or see them. They're going to be there in the room with you. Another major issue that you're going to run into, and this is something that people will argue about until the end of time, but I'm right, and I'm going to say it, is that technology is inherently distracting. At least to most people. I'm aware that you are some kind of crazy exception and you have this massive attention span and stuff. And if you're watching me, I'm glad that you have a large attention span because I have a tendency to ramble to get to my points. So I appreciate that. However, people also do tend to overestimate their own abilities, especially their own abilities to focus and to be productive. People say they're more productive at work than they really are and they deserve more money and all kinds of things. There's massive productivity losses when you put people in front of computers. There's also gains, but people find ways to distract themselves, to avoid getting off into the weeds and citing studies and things like that. People like to distract themselves. People will get distracted if they have a phone in their pockets. They will pull it out and start clicking around on it, even when they're trying to do other tasks. People, when they are in front of a computer, might lose track of what they are doing and start to open different tabs and watch a million different YouTube videos, or they see an ad for Amazon and they start looking at things. Which is generally why when I play, there's a select few people who I will allow to use computers either due to accessibility because they have a disability, inability to find or afford physical implements of play, but somehow they have a laptop, which I have run into before. Seriously, there's obviously weird exceptions for everyone, or they just actually have a crazy long attention span and they're fine to be in front of a computer and they won't look at it unless they have to and they just have their character sheet and stuff on there. That is all fine. If you are a dungeon master and you want to play music during your game or you want to look up a rule for 5 minutes, it's also fine to have a computer in front of you. That is completely acceptable. I like to have only the DM with a computer when I'm playing. If I could, which I can't anymore because they're too ubiquitous, I would have people put cell phones in a basket so they aren't distracted by them during play as well. But people are very possessive of their phones. I guess they look at weird shit on their phones and they don't want you to look through their phones or something like that. They don't want to give them up, which is fine. If they have them in their pockets, it's okay. But I like to have only the DM with a computer. People will get distracted if you let them have tablets and things, unless you are watching it like a hawk. It's more trouble than it's worth. Give them paper character sheets. If you're the DM, you have a laptop, you might be able to play music. That's it. When you are playing on something like Roll20, or Fantasy Grounds, or Tabletop Simulator, unless you're in VR where it's very difficult to use a browser, you are now on a computer. And so is everyone else. I have a pretty decent attention span, and I've found myself during really boring games checking my email once or twice. I saw it myself when I realized that I'm doing it. I can definitely count on one hand the number of times that I've done it, but it's very disrespectful and I shouldn't be doing it. And I evaluate myself as having a decent attention span. Other people that I've played with do not have very good attention spans, and that is fine. If they were in a situation where you were playing with them in person, and there weren't even computers, pretty much, as it was when D&D and other games first came out, this wouldn't be a problem. You wouldn't be running into this issue of them goofing off with other things. They might distractedly like fiddle with a dice or something, but they could not become immersed in another activity while they're trying to play D&D. You're going to have players that are getting like 50 tabs open of like Facebook and YouTube videos, and they're doing their online shopping and things at the same time. They're going to be distracted from the play experience, and that's going to impact other players, right? Because it'll be a knock-on effect. Even if all your players are paying attention except for one, now there's other players that are getting distracted by the fact that that guy's distracted, and you can kind of tell because they're not talking, and you're asking them what's wrong, and trying to involve them, and it ends up in this gigantic spider web of like lies and deception. No, I wasn't looking at Amazon, but you can't tell because even your webcam isn't facing the screen. That's a huge problem. You have to police that one like a hawk. One of the ways to fix that, which I'll explain in a later video about live streamed games, is just live streaming the game and kind of making it more of a theatrical presentation than a game at that point, which comes with its own negatives, and I don't really like that as a solution either, but at least then people have a motivation to pay attention because somebody else in this audience of, it'll end up being like 50 people who watch your video. Somebody else might see them doing that, and the punishment for social ostracism, or the perceived punishment of social ostracism, will scare people straight. So getting distracted like that is going to be a problem as well. Another issue that you'll run into, which also is actually a solution with playing online or with virtual books and stuff in general, is that it's hard to find rules. Increasingly, it's actually not a problem to do that. There's SRD repositories for all the rules for 5th edition, Dungeons & Dragons, 3.5, Pathfinder. I'm sure many other games, I'm sure like Call of Cthulhu or something, has some sort of a rules directory for it as well. And this is actually a great way to find different rules. You can pretty much play Pathfinder without actually buying any rule book, which is great. But the speed at which you find rules is still kind of slow for more obscure games. So we'll say for more obscure games. For Pathfinder and 5th edition, I'm sure you can find all the rules that you want in like one search, or you can have them tabbed, and that's good. If you're playing games that I like to play, older school games, you're going to have to flip through PDFs and stuff, and it's going to take forever, whereas just having the book, it's actually much quicker, especially if you're willing to put tabs in your books. And you know which book it's in because you played it a bunch. It's a core rule or something like that. You can just flip open your player's handbook or your core rule book, and you can flip to that labeled tab, and you have the rule immediately. And that also kind of runs into the obsession with being able to actually look up all the rules online at any time. Will limit the agency of your dungeon master as well. I'm 100% for playing by the rules 100% correctly all of the time. However, D&D and other games actually are things that take a tremendous amount of time to play as intended, even if you're going kind of quickly. It's very good if you can have your dungeon master have sort of authority to create or improvise or to expand on rules ideas that are in the book without being challenged. Some of the time, at least. It, again, heavily system dependent. I don't even want to say it's more an old school style of play thing. It's very context dependent, but I'm sure that you've come into a situation where you'd be fine if the dungeon master had to kind of think on the fly because he didn't really have a rule book on hand. And having players that are always able to search up whatever, whenever, will challenge the agency of the dungeon master a tremendous amount. Or if a spell is written so that it's kind of a surprise and it actually works correctly by the rules, but you're being challenged constantly, that's an issue. It is an issue. Because you're, like I was saying in that video about how your homebrew is not official, your homebrew is not official content, and you can't use it to evaluate the system or say that you like D&D because of your homebrew scenario or what have you. But homebrew is an inherent part of the way that everyone plays. Everybody plays the game slightly differently. Even if you run the game out of the book without trying to change anything, you probably will run it very slightly differently than another dungeon master would, or you'd play a different way than another player would. And the homebrew creation experience is part of what makes you a good dungeon master. Is part of what you would evaluate your dungeon mastering or playing ability on, is your ability to create things that fit within the initial rules system, but expand on concepts or add new things to the game. Without the complete freedom to do that, because everyone's too awash in all this media, or not media, but game media, things that are published, rule books, SRDs, stuff like that, you're going to start to run into problems. And this is not an issue only with playing online. It's one issue that you will run into when you're playing online. But this would also be something that you'd run into if you were playing and you had every player with like a laptop, or you're a DM and you're obsessed with playing by the rules, so you're looking things up all the time. It will limit your creativity, and it will limit like the modules and things that you can play if they kind of expand outside of the rules and things as well. So I'm sure I could just keep going on forever, but we'll try to wrap this up. Why am I so critical of all of these virtual tabletops, and why do I play on them? So, why do I play on them? We'll answer that first. I live in a rural area, let's say. There's not a lot of gaming groups around. The only ones that I could get to at major cities are a tremendous amount of distance away, or at least to the point where it would be very inconvenient for me to play. And I've been playing on virtual tabletops for a long time, so I feel somewhat comfortable playing there. And I still run into these problems, but I persist because there are people who are worth playing with, let's say, even if you have to do it online. Because they're such good players that even in a reduced capacity of playing online, they're still very good. And I like to experience the way that different people play or dungeon master a game for my own learning as well. And one of the fastest and easiest ways to do that is to play just a bunch of online games, because you will learn tricks or things that they've figured out, even if, again, it's in a kind of reduced capacity or in a non-ideal situation of playing online. So that's why people should play online. If you are new to the game, I don't think you should play online. But if you're someone who at least has a basic understanding of the rules of something like Pathfinder or 5th edition, you should actually look to try and play online if you just can't get a game in your local area, or if you're kind of between games and you want to just get ideas of what to do or what not to do from somebody who's running an online game. You shouldn't necessarily shy away from that. Just know what you're getting into when you go into it. That's why I'm still playing on all of these virtual tabletop softwares. And the reason why they exist and why I'm not like railing against them in a large capacity, I suppose that I spent a whole video just railing against them in a way. But the reason why I'm not super frustrated that everyone's playing on VTTs and stuff is that even though it is always going to be a worse experience, you know that going in, right? The Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop games, even tabletop skirmish games that you can play on VTTs, were not designed to be played on virtual tabletops. Maybe you could argue that 4th edition, it's a video game, you can play it on a tabletop. Maybe. But pretty much every other game is designed to be played on a traditional tabletop with other people there to teach you how to play, and you have your dice, and you have your board, and they're all made at least halfway with the new games that know about virtual tabletops existing, especially with the older games that were made way before VTTs existed. They were designed to be played on a normal tabletop with or without a battle mat with other people there. So when you go into a virtual tabletop, if you go in with the idea that like this is kind of an experiment in order to try to get a percentage of the tabletop experience into an online space, you'll have a very, or at least fairly positive outlook on the experiences that you have, even if they kind of suck compared to like playing in a game store at your house or something like that. If you go into it either having not played a tabletop game or thinking that it's going to be like the full experience of playing Dungeons and Dragons, you're going to run into a problem. Your experience is going to be way, way, way worse than what you would have if you played in person. and you might end up thinking that's all the game has to offer, which is a problem, because then I think that you would be tempted to quit. Obviously, 5th edition isn't very good, and that's what a lot of people play on VTTs as well, but even if I ran a very good game like Shadowrun on a VTT, and that was someone's first time playing Shadowrun, they would end up probably thinking the game kind of sucks. If they don't know that it's going to be kind of a reduced, hacked-together version because we're playing on a VTT, they probably wouldn't like the game very much, and they wouldn't want to play it again. Whereas, if you go in knowing that that it's going to be kind of a shitty version of the normal game, you'll have a more positive outlook. Or, if you've been sort of indoctrinated and brought up playing only on VTTs, you might actually think that is how the game was meant to play. That your limited ability to play and like the awkwardness and all kinds of stuff, all the problems that I just mentioned that are inherent to VTTs, or at least that you run into when you're playing on a virtual tabletop, all of those are just part of the game as standard. And then you might not ever have a will to go to a convention or to a game store or to someone's house when they're advertising like a D&D night on Tuesday or something like that. You might go, no, I've already played this before on VTTs, and I know what D&D is, I know what Shadowrun is, I know what Pathfinder is, and I can just keep doing this, and you think that it's the same experience, which it isn't, which might be limiting your capacity to be a player and a dungeon master, and that's something to be afraid of.